On April 16th, there began in the Austrian capital a series of prayers and processions for the success of the war against France and against Napoleon. These processions, composed of schools of young girls and boys, together with people of the working classes, lasted a fortnight. Preceded by banners and flags of every color, they marched through the streets and suburbs of Vienna and went to pray in the Cathedral of St. Stephen and the principal churches. The court did not fail to be present at these prayers. The Empress of Austria formerly asked her stepdaughter to be present with the rest of her family, but was unable to induce her to do so. So pressing were her requests that the case was submitted to the Emperor of Austria and to two of his brothers, and their opinion was opposed to such an action. The sentiments manifested by the Empress were in harmony with her position, but I am sorry to say that she appeared only to make this concession so as to be able to persist in her determination not to return to France. I had just received a letter from the Emperor, another from King Joseph, and another from the Queen, his wife, addressed to the Empress by special messenger, and I handed them to her, telling her that I was discharging a duty which had been laid upon me. She reminded me that she could only take them to hand them over to her father, and that if I thought right to keep them, she would act as if she heard nothing about them. As these letters were intended for her, and it was better that they should be read, I begged her to take them and to do what she thought right with them. Some words were afterwards exchanged between us on the very painful subject of her refusal to join the Emperor. She answered with some vivacity, but, however, with her usual gentleness, that her resolution on this head was irrevocable. When I objected that there was no such thing as an irrevocable engagement and that circumstances might arise which would render her return to France obligatory, she made haste to answer that even her father's rights did not extend as far as that. I could not help remarking in my turn that the sentiments which she was manifesting were unjust and quite out of harmony with her character, that if the French nation were to hear of her repugnance, it would be much hurt, for nothing could be more painful to the French than to see their affection despised, and that then they would reject her after having ardently desired her as a pledge of peace. This conversation was the last I ever had with her on the subject. She seemed to have made up her mind with so much obstinacy that it appeared to me quite useless to refer to the subject again. Time and events, moreover, were our only masters. Prince Anthony of Saxony, the king's brother, was living in retirement and in bad health at Schönbrunn. The Empress Marie-Louise frequently went to see him. This family was under a ban on account of the affection which its head had shown for Napoleon. Poor Prince Anthony, although he was the Emperor of Austria's brother-in-law, had an army of bailiffs in his palace in Dresden and was forced to pay for their keep. The king, who was even worse treated, was entirely without resources and lived on the proceeds of the sale of some diamonds, which did not always suffice for paying all his household expenses, limited as his household was to a very small number of faithful servants whose keep cost him about 16,000 francs a month. The Prussians seemed to have formed the plan of reducing this prince by means of starvation, and they were pitilessly pursuing the invasion of one half of his states. The king had for a long time refused to agree to this dismemberment of his territory, but he was at last obliged to resign himself to the painful sacrifices which were imposed upon him by brutal force. This expression will not appear too strong when it is compared with the odious principles enunciated in a letter from Lord Castlereagh to Prince Hardenberg, which was produced at the debates in the English Parliament. This letter strikes the keynote of the abuse of prepotency, which marked the majority of the acts of the Congress. The King of Saxony was not only despoiled of the Duchy of Warsaw, but one half of his hereditary states, with which Prussia, in her moderation, was good enough to content herself. He had left Pressburg to come and reside in the chateau of Luxembourg, where he was near the tribunal which was to without appeal on the fate of Saxony. He wanted to return to Dresden. In spite of his resignation, permission to live in his capital during the war was for a long time refused him, nor was it hidden from him that there were good reasons why he should be treated with distrust. He was forced to send 2 of his nephews, sons of Prince Maximilian, to serve in the Austrian army as hostages who would be a guarantee of his fidelity. He came incognito to see his brother at Schönbrunn, and these 2 pariahs of royal blood wept in unison over the disasters of their house. The cessation of festivities and the absence of Prince Eugene appeared to have disturbed the Emperor Alexander's habits. He used to go and kill some of his time every day at the house of Prince Schwarzenberg. I was constantly hearing of the complaints made by the field marshal at the way in which he was bothered. When he had arranged to spend a day with his family and had selected one of his chateaus so as to be more at his ease, he would see Alexander come and insist on forming one of the party. Prince Schwarzenberg, who was a man of independent character, did not always dissemble his irritation at these constant assiduities on the part of the Tsar. His departure for the army at last delivered him from them. He had announced that he would come and take leave of the Empress, but no doubt a feeling of decency prevented him from keeping this promise. A piece of news which at that time passed unnoticed, except at Schönbrunn, where it created great excitement, was the death of Countess Neipperg. This lady, who had remained in Württemberg, which was General Neipperg's birthplace, whilst he came to employ his talents in Vienna, died in the month of April after an illness of 2 days, leaving 4 boys behind her. She was said to have been very pretty, but only moderately intelligent. Count Neipperg had run away with her from her first husband, who was still living a few months before his wife's death. The way in which Marie-Louise announced this death one day at table showed that she did not regret it very much. The Empress of Austria had taken care to keep her stepdaughter informed of what was going on in Italy. The last news which she sent her was altogether unfavorable to the Neapolitans, and this was confirmed by letters from General Neipperg. This general informed the Duchess of Parma that the regiment of her bodyguards, having refused to march against the Neapolitans and having shouted, "Long live the Emperor," had been disbanded. The Empress Marie-Louise blazed up on reading this. She did not speak of punishing the authors of what she at least had no right to consider a rebellion, because by her character she had a dislike for severity, but she reserved to herself to reward those who had remained faithful. The Emperor of Austria anticipated her, informing her that he was going to reorganize her regiment and reduce it to 3,000 men instead of the 5,000 or 6,000 who had formerly composed it. This was a favor which looked very much like an increase of charges. It was to be noticed that since the news of the military events which forejudged the issue of the Neapolitan question and ensured the pacification of Italy, the animosity of the high personages at the Congress had increased in intensity, and that the violence of the German newspapers had increased. The Congress busied itself with nothing but deliberations against the common enemy. The offensive treaties were renewed, and the sovereigns were pledged by transactions about which no time was given them to reflect. Austria, Russia, and Prussia signed new conventions for subsidies with England. The whole of Europe was set on foot as one man. 3 great Russian armies were set to march through Hungary and Silesia. Austria was assembling an army in Piedmont and another on the Rhine. Prussia was making extraordinary efforts. She was organizing 2 armies in the Netherlands and on the Rhine. All the princes of Germany were sending their contingents in soldiers of the line and Landwehr. England was landing troops in Holland. Spain was assembling troops. More than 1 million soldiers were marching against Napoleon. At last, on May 12th, all the powers confirmed their declaration on March 13th and declared war upon France if she recognized Napoleon as her sovereign. The Emperor Alexander had been the most animated. This prince, who had been Napoleon's guest, whom he had loaded with apparent expressions of friendship, declared, with the greatest vehemence and under an oath that he would let his last soldier be killed and would spend his last ruble to prevent Napoleon from ascending the throne of France once more and remaining there. The decisive successes of the Austrians in Italy against King Joachim had dissipated the doubts which the Empress had had till then as to the fate of her states of Parma. No obstacle seemed in her eyes to stand in the way of her taking speedy possession of these territories. From that time on, all thought of returning to France was effaced from her mind, and all thoughts turned towards Parma. She occupied herself with unusual attention in studying the principal branches of the administration of the country, but above all the resources which it offered for private life. She informed herself with all details in the most comfortable way of establishing herself there, of the internal arrangements of the Palace of Parma, of the new disposal of rooms which would have to be carried out, of the summer country houses, and finally of the various improvements which could be carried out in the various residences. She gave orders for the organization of the ducal household and for the nominations to all the functions at court. These occupations, which I am far from speaking of in a spirit of blame, took up all her time during several days. She attached to her establishment in Parma the interest which is felt by a new landowner who, never having had the free disposal of the estates which she has inhabited, finds himself at last master of a domain where he is able to exercise an undivided authority. She planned out excursions to Florence, Genoa, Rome, Naples, where King Joachim would no longer be reigning, to England, etc., and annual visits to Vienna to see her son. This was the unvarying subject of her conversations. The official journal had published an edict on April 14th, ignored till then, by which the Duchess of Parma begged her father to administer the duchies provisionally in her name until circumstances would allow her to proceed there in person. This edict, dated March 3rd, bore the Emperor of Austria's acceptance. Before leaving for the army, the Archduke John, Viceroy of Italy, came to take leave of Marie-Louise, this visit having given her the opportunity of speaking of a remark which had been made by this prince on hearing the first news of the emperor's departure from the island of Elba. "My poor Louise, I am sorry for you. What I hope for you, and for all of us, is that he may break his neck." I could not help remarking to the empress that without any doubt she disapproved of such words. She admitted that these wounds were to be blamed, but she found that the feeling which had dictated them was excusable on the part of princes for whom the emperor's return to France was a great calamity. On the same day, she was called on by the Grand Duke of Baden, who was to leave on the morrow, but who, according to his statement, was detained in Vienna to give certain explanations. On a note which she had addressed to the Congress, a note the object of which was certain claims relating to the supremacy of the federative diet established by the same Congress, according to which all German affairs were to be decided by Austria's influence and under the precedence of an Austrian minister. It seems to me that it will not be entirely without interest to relate here the last act of the Empress Marie-Louise, which I witnessed before my departure from Vienna, although it only interested this princess's conscience. I allude to it all because it is an indication of her religious feelings. She discharged her devotional duties in the chapel of Schönbrunn at 7 o'clock in the morning in her father's presence. On that day, Count Saint-Vital, who had been appointed her Grand Chamberlain, fulfilled the functions of his post for the first time. More than 3 weeks had passed by since I had been ordered to wait an audience with Prince Metternich before returning to France. Counting no longer on this audience with the Prime Minister, I regretted to see my departure delayed in pure waste of time. If it entered into the secret views of the Austrian cabinet to resign itself to a reconciliation with the Emperor Napoleon, it seemed evident to me that events, still uncertain and perhaps remote, would alone be able to force it to such a step. There was accordingly no further reason for my presence in Vienna, nor were there any motives for prolonging it. I renewed my request for a passport, but the Emperor Francis was at that time suffering from an indisposition which prevented him from attending to business of any sort. Later on, another objection was made against the realization of my plan connected with the visa, which was described as indispensable. This visa had to be given to my passport by Prince Schwarzenberg. An order having forbidden all communication with the left bank of the Rhine, the signature of the commander-in-chief of the Austrian army had become necessary for crossing the river. Now, Monsieur de Schwarzenberg had already left for his general headquarters, and this absence complicated the difficulties. After much opposition, I was given to hope that I should be able to leave if I took a place in the carriage of an Austrian officer, a proposal to which I eagerly agreed. At last I received a passport from the state chancery, but another week was lost in the formalities of the visa and complications of every kind. It was only after a quantity of applications and notifications with generals Stipsix and Landnau that I definitely obtained permission to start on accepting the escort of an Austrian officer. I could have no politer nor more attentive traveling companion than Captain Kertzai, a young Hungarian officer who had already accompanied the Empress Marie-Louise when she was leaving France under the events of 1814, and later on also during this princess's journey to Aix in Savoy. Before leaving, I went to take leave of the young prince at the Imperial Palace of Vienna. It grieved me to notice his serious and even melancholy air. He had lost that childish cheerfulness and that loquacity which had so much charm in him. He did not come to meet me, as he was accustomed to do, and saw me enter without giving any sign that he knew me. One might have said that misfortune was already beginning its work on his young head, which a great lesson of Providence seems to have adorned with a crown on his entrance into life, so as to give a fresh example of the vanity of human greatness. He was like one of those victims destined for sacrifice, who are adorned with flowers, although he had already spent 6 weeks with the persons to whom he had been confided, with whom I found him. He had not yet got accustomed to them, and seemed to look upon their faces still strange to him with distrust. I asked him in their presence if he had a message which I could take for him to his father. He looked at me in a sad and significant way, then gently freeing his hand from my grasp, he withdrew silently into the embrasure of a window some distance off. After having exchanged some words with the persons who were in the drawing room, I approached the spot to which he had withdrawn, and where he was standing looking on with an attentive air. As I bent down to him to say farewell, struck with my emotion, he drew me towards the window, and looking at me with a touching expression, he whispered to me, "Monsieur Méneval, you will tell him that I am still very fond of him." The poor orphan already felt that he was no longer free, and that he was no longer with his father's friends. He had had great difficulty in forgetting his Mamacue, as he used to call her. He kept asking for her of Madame Marchand, who had been left with him and who was very fond of him, this excellent woman who had received him in her arms at his birth and who had identified herself with him, returned to France a year later. Her departure was a fresh source of sorrow for the young prince. When they ceased calling him by the name of Napoleon, he was greatly displeased, for he found the name of Francis, which had been forced on him, both trivial and ugly. I admit that such impressions are the impressions of children of his age whose habits have been brusquely broken in upon, and that they are only temporary and soon give way before the unhappy mobility of their character. One might have said that the gravity of the circumstances in which the young prince found himself placed had been revealed to his intelligence and had hastened on his maturity. I left him in a state of flourishing good health. His constitution was robust and promised a long life, free from infirmities. He was handsome, good, and full of amiable qualities, which later on won for him his grandfather's affection.